So my presentation tonight, this is the first time I've done this, so I'm glad actually George asked me because I kind of wanted to do something like this, and it's a good opportunity. I'm just calling it Postcard Timeline, and it's kind of a deltiologist guide, deltiologist being a postcard guy, to what happened when, mainly in Canada. In other words, just kind of going to give you, as stamp collectors who probably come across postcards frequently, but maybe haven't studied them, as such, an idea of at what times various types of postcards and various innovations within postcards occurred. And I hope that would help you, maybe recognize some things that you have that may be more valuable than you realized, or just let you know kind of what to look out for in terms of postcards that are early examples of different innovations in the craft of making postcards. So what it works out to is just kind of a history, as George was saying, of postcards from the earliest days up to most recent days. Um, sorry, there. So the story begins in 1840, which probably is a familiar year to stamp collectors, with what is thought of as the very first postcard, at least by some people's standards. This card called penny penates, which was made in England and by an artist called Theodore Hook and sent in July of 1840 to himself. He sent it to himself, and it has penny black on it and that kind of thing. Um, this card was actually, although it's quite important in the history of postcards, was actually not recognized until, I believe, until the turn of this century, when it was discovered in a collection in a stamp collector's collection, and it hadn't being recognized for its significance as a postcard. So I thought it was a good thing to start with, just to emphasize the point that you can look at all of these things that we deal with in more than one way. So you can look at them as a stamp collector, as a collector of this card did, and you see it's interesting in that way, at the same time as you may not realize the interest that it holds to a postcard collector, which in this case was enormous because it is supposedly the earliest postcard, which kind of makes sense given that it came out just a couple months after the first penny blacks uh, were issued. So that's sort of the lesson I would take from that, is there's more than one way to look at these things, and we're just going to look at them from a deltiologist point of view tonight. Now, of course, some people would say this wasn't technically a postcard, and they would be right in the sense that it's not a card. It's not the kind of postcard that was recognized as a specific category of mail by the post office, and it didn't have a special rate attached to it and regulations and all that kind of thing. It's just a card that was sent through the regular mail, but it has the shape and form of a postcard. So in that other sense, it is a postcard. But of course, you can debate which things, especially the early things, count as postcards and which don't until you're blue in the face. But I prefer not to do that. So this is what I would call the first postcard. On that same vein, even before postcards were recognized as an official category of mail, they were sent through the 1840s, 50s, 60s. In this case, this is an example from my collection, as book post, which was a category of mail that, as some of you may know much better than I do, had its own special rate that was initially established, I think, in aid of the circulating libraries that existed in England in the 19th century, and wanted to send books at a feasible postage rate. But it was extended to other types of mail. And even before postcards were officially recognized, the book post, this type of card was sent by book post. So here's another example of a hand illustrated postcard sent to someone. I'm not really sure who the artist was or who the recipient was in 1868. So you can find these very early postcards, sort of proto postcards. If you look hard, they're not easily found, but they do exist. So it's always difficult to say exactly when postcards began for that reason. But when we get into the official postcard, i.e. postcards as an official category of mail, is in 1869, and we can actually attribute it to one or at most two different men of the time who lived in Austria and Germany. Uh, the fellow here who's pictured on a much later commemorative card is usually thought of as the father of the postcard. His name was Dr. Emanuel Hermann, and he was an economist in Vienna, I think. And in 1869, I think it's the 26th of January, he published the article that's depicted at the right here in a Austrian newspaper, making the suggestion or making the case for the issuance of postcards. He was an economist. The impetus for the creation of the postcard was economic. I mean, what he saw was an opportunity for simple communications to take place at a half price rate as opposed to the letter rate at a lower rate, and that would increase communication for the purposes of business and the sending of simple acknowledgments and receipts and that kind of thing through the mail. So that was the idea initially with postcards, which were created as government cards, right? They were just, I'll just come into it in a moment. Uh, the idea had actually been suggested before by Dr. Heinrich von Stephan, who was the first or was to be the first German postmaster general and another figure of great influence at the time. So he, along with Herman, are the two people that are identified as the fathers of postcards. But the initial cards, as I was about to say, look like this. This is the Austrian correspondence card that was issued for the first time on the 1st of October, 1869. And these government cards, which you can't tell the size, but you've probably seen them. They're quite small compared to contemporary postcards. Were the only cards that were authorized at the time. There weren't private postcards, there weren't picture postcards or anything like that. They were just these cards with an address spot on the front, and then on the back it was just blank, and you could put your message there on the backs. So that's an example. I think that's my earliest one from 1870 of the very first type of postcard. And that's the back. Again, just a message. There's something, an official Austrian post office message. The post office assumes no responsibility for the content of this message. There was a lot of concern at the time about the public nature of the communications. The mail still had an air, that went back centuries to being something secretive. Mail was sent often in mail was associated with diplomatic context, political context, where the communications were meant to be secret. So the idea that you would just write a message on the back of a card that everyone could see it took a lot of getting used to for people at that time. But anyway, that was how it looked in the very first year of postcards. The idea caught on very quickly in Europe. So in 1869-70, other countries adopted it. They saw the success of it. And in June of 1871, Canada became the first country outside of Europe to adopt the postcard. So they created their own version, or we created our own version of the Austrian correspondence card that we just saw. Similar sort of design, one color and the address on one side, pre-printed stamp, and the blank back. So that's an example from 1871. They were printed by the British American Banknote Company in Montreal and Ottawa in the earliest years. So that's just an example of what it looked like initially. The uses, as consistent with Dr. Herman's thoughts, in the early years were mainly commercial uses. So one common use was by banks to send their remittance notices, usually to other banks or other branches. So this is an early example of a bank, a branch of the Molson's Bank in Morrisburg, Ontario, sending, actually in Brockville, sending it to Morrisburg nearby a message about money that had been received and that kind of thing. So they pre-printed their forms on the backs of the postcards. You were allowed to do that, and that was very common. So you get a lot of these. I collect these. They're very interesting of these old Canadian banks. There's a surprising number of banks were active in the 1870s and 1880s. So that's an example of a typical use in Canada of these cards, these early, usually called postal cards. Other types of pre-printed or printed information were also added to cards. This is an early illustration. It's a card that I acquired. It's actually in one of the illustrations that Alan Steinhardt put into his book, The Postal History of the Postcard in Canada, which is the book you should have if you're interested in this early era of postal cards in Canada. So I think he says or implies that it's the first example of an actual illustration appearing on a Canadian card, dating to the 15th of November of 1871. So just a few months after the cards began to be introduced. It's a St. Andrew's Society message. So that was another common type of use, is just to send out messages about meetings like we had today. We sent out our messages by email for this meeting, but the St. Andrew's Society in 1871 would do so by a postal card. There were occasionally personal uses. You don't find them very often, especially in Canada. But that's an example, again, from 1871, very early, of somebody using it for a personal message. Again, that's sort of the kind of point I'd like to make, is that if you find something like that, it is unusual. So you might want to just put it aside as kind of a nice thing to have, because you don't really find, especially in the very early years, them used for personal letters. Again, people were a bit hesitant to use them that way because of the privacy issue. So that's in 1871 as well. When it came to illustrations, the sort of postcards with views on them that we're used to seeing, they began to develop fairly quickly in Germany. So Germany is where, and Austria are where almost all the innovations of postcards began, and this is no exception. So you began to see some use of cards for souvenir purposes, tourist purposes, that had illustrations like this on them. So this is actually an 1899 card. It's just showing both sides here, actually commemorating the 25th anniversary of what they then thought was the first view card, the first card showing a view on it. So even by 1899, they already had a sense of postcards as kind of a historical thing, and were interested in the history of postcards even at that early stage. And this is what they claimed. I don't know whether it's still the received opinion was the first view card. It had been issued in 1874 in Germany. So the Germans did have some view cards as early as the 1870s. By the 1880s, they had in Germany again quite a lot of these, and they were assuming their modern form as tourist items as early as 1880. This is an example from my collection of 1889, with a series of views on them. The German regulations allowed private cards, so not the postal cards, but actual privately issued and privately created cards that you had to stamp with no pre-printed stamp, as early as the early 1880s. And that freed up the market for a lot more creativity and ushered in what's called the Grußhaus age. Grußhaus just being greetings from, which was the characteristic greeting on German postcards that created the big fad that began around 1890 in Germany, that eventually swept across the world, including North America some years later. In the US, you'll often hear that the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the Columbian exposition rather, of that year, was sort of the beginning of the idea of view cards in the United States, which is largely true. There were some cards, I'm told, a little earlier than that, but the cards that were issued semi-officially for the Chicago World's Fair in 1893 are usually regarded as the first real emergence of postcards in the United States. And no wonder they're really beautiful cards. This is just one example. You often find them actually postmarked at the fair. This is one sent here to Ontario. And they show a lot of the different buildings that were built for the uh, for the event. So these 1893 cards are nice to find. They're not incredibly rare because so many people were at the fair and so many people kept the cards, but they're really great and many people do collect them. So that's 1893. These are still not private postcards, which were not allowed in Canada or the United States at that time, but they're getting close to that. In Canada, you also begin to see the beginnings of some view cards at an early stage, 1893 again. This is a card which I think is probably the earliest strictly speaking view card in Canada. It's a Canadian card. You can see it's printed on a government postcard back, but it does have a view of Niagara Falls. It's taken from the American side actually, but it's a Canadian card. So again, the tourism industry was kind of behind the push towards getting view cards, and where would you find that more than at Niagara Falls? So often the very earliest things of this kind would happen at a place like Niagara Falls, where there was such an economic incentive to create tourist souvenirs that they pushed postcard the development of postcards forward. So that's an 1893 card as well, with a Canadian story to it. And that's written, as you can see, it's signed by Mama. And so it's a personal card, again, tourist thing. So that wasn't a private postcard, it was on a postal back. It wasn't until 1895 that private postcards were allowed in Canada. We saw they were allowed in Germany almost 15 years before, but in Canada it was 1895, just shortly after the UK did it. So it was the Postmaster General of Canada during the government of Mackenzie Bowell who issued the order in late 1894 that as of January the 1st, 1895, um, private postcards were to be allowed. It's interesting, I found something that said that by 1894, the postal cards, the government ones, made up about 18% of all the letters posted in Canadian post offices. So 23.7 million cards of that type were posted in 1894, even though they had no pictures and they were just those boring little cards. They were really popular. So there must have been a push to allow people to design private postcards, and that was formalized in 1895. Um, it was allowed as of January the 1st, 1895, but for some reason that I've never been able to figure out, you don't actually see any until May and June of that year. I don't know why. But this is a card that I have that is, at least from members of the Toronto Postcard Club's perspective, the earliest one that anyone has seen. I'm sure there must be earlier ones, but this was posted on May the 20th of 1895. And it's been made by a fellow called R.B. Andrew from Bowmanville, who I think had a piano store or furniture store and seems to have really got into the uh, postcard spirit and created this card to send with respect to his business and to his friends. So that's an very early Canadian card. So if you see a Canadian card, private card from 1895, again, that's a really early one and something that you might want to put aside. It's they're not very common actually. This is another example from 1895 by Copp Clark, which was a printing company itself, as you know, used to print a lot of our school books, I think. And so the designs of these early cards are really beautiful. They're designed to attract attention, um, in the mail because they were used for advertisements. And so they're quite elegant and really nice to collect when you can find them. So that was sent out to Kenora, or Rat Portage as it then was, in November of that year. In 1895 was also the year of the first strictly view card of that was a private card. We had the Niagara card before, but that was a postal card. This was a private card. It's called Beautiful Berry, and it was published by Grip Company. Were lithographers. I think they were quite famous because the group of 7 members worked there at one time too. And so it's a multi-view, very similar to the designs they had in Germany that were already old hat in Germany by that time, showing scenes from around the city of Barrie, north of Toronto. They were published by a fellow called Alexander Scott, and he's actually was a subject of an article just about 10 years later where he explained why he did it. He'd been to England, he'd seen some of the cards that they had over there and decided it would be nice to do it in Canada. But kind of oddly, there were no other cards of this type for at least 2 more years that I'm aware of. So there's this one card in 1895 of Barrie, and then there's nothing else for the next couple of years of the same type. No more view cards, showing a view of a city or that kind of thing. So there's kind of the gap years here. The view cards were becoming popular elsewhere, private view cards like in London. That's an example from England there. But in the United States and Canada, they didn't exist yet. United States for a very good reason that the private cards were not allowed in the United States until 1898. But in Canada, not sure why they didn't make more after Beautiful Berry, but they didn't. There were a few little things that came out in 1897. There's these Worth's mail souvenir cards, which are kind of folders that could be sent. They looked a lot like postcards on the back. You can see the back there on the left. And sometimes you'll find them detached. You could there was like a series of views that folded out, and they had blank backs, and sometimes people detached them and sent them as postcards. So you'll find them that way. And there was a set for Montreal and a set for Toronto, and possibly also a set for Ottawa in Canada, along with a large number in the United States as well. So that's an example there that was sent in 1898, but they were issued a year before. They're kind of some of the earliest ones that you'll see. So they're nice to find. If you can find them as a whole folder, it's quite nice because they're very rare. They're kind of flimsy and they fell apart a lot. And there's your stamp, just to, 'cause I know you all like stamps. Queen Victoria. There's a couple of other cards came out in 1897. There was a card made for the Epworth League convention in Toronto. The Epworth League was a Methodist organization, and this one actually has some sort of halftone views of Toronto, so it's getting towards the more modern type of card in some ways. But it was still pretty uncommon, and you do see this card fairly often, but they usually ask a fair bit for it. Where things really changed was in 1898, when a couple of things happened. First of all, private cards were authorized in the United States as of May of that year, so that unleashed a huge number south of the border. Canada, we'd already had it for three years, but they hadn't taken too much advantage of it other than for advertising cards. So in that year, 1898, the J.C. Wilson Company of Montreal began to issue patriotic cards, of which this is a very famous example. J.C. Wilson was a manufacturer of paper bags and paper products, and J.C. Wilson himself was a member of parliament and a senator, I think, and he was obviously very patriotic and wanted to promote this idea that was common around the time of as the kind of the Boer War was about to start and the Cuban American Spanish American War was happening. This idea of Anglo-Saxon unity, and it was felt that Canada could play this very vital role as a middleman between the United States and United Kingdom in creating sort of an Anglo-Saxon alliance in the world. So these cards all promote that idea and often have both American and British symbolism on them. So this is one of them, the 1898, when they began to be issued. And there's some varieties of this. One of our members has a website called jcwilson.ca and also another one called vintagepostcards.ca. And on those sites, he has an incredibly detailed sort of catalog of all the different J.C. Wilson cards and other cards of the time, and including the many, many varieties of these J.C. Wilson cards. So they must have gone through many, many printings and they changed them a little bit here and there each time. So there's a lot to collect there. Some people really get into that. One of the big differences or sort of things to look for with this particular card is the lion, because in some of the editions, the lion is winking, which is like at the top right there, and then other times both of his eyes are open. So that's one of the things you're meant to look for when you're trying to get all of the dozens of varieties of this particular card, for example. But he has it all on his website, and I'd recommend that to you. And other J.C. Wilson patriotics include these two, again with our winking lion in a different pose. On the lower left, there's a couple of half-cent Queen Victoria stamps, which are always nice to find on postcards. Don't do it too often. And then on upper right, there's a more purely American card saying, expressing Canada's sympathies over the sinking of the Maine, which of course was the great cause célèbre in the Spanish-American War. And so that card with the stars and stripes is very well known also to U.S. collectors. These cards by J.C. Wilson, these patriotic cards, were quite unique, not just in Canada, but anywhere at the time, in terms of just how well done they were and their patriotic themes. So they're actually quite well known, not just in Canada, but among collectors elsewhere too. Besides J.C. Wilson at the time, 1898, there was another company in Toronto. J.C. Wilson was from Montreal. In Toronto, there was the Toronto Lithographing Company that produced a great number of cards, not so much in the patriotic vein, but views of cities in particular. So they produced in 1898 a set of about 20 views of Canadian cities, mostly in Eastern Canada, but as far west as Winnipeg. So that's Niagara Falls and Halifax. There's usually two views of each city for most of them. So those are another very collectible set of early cards. For all of these, getting the 1898 postmark is sort of the desirable thing, and then they become a little bit less expensive if they've got later postmarks on them. All these cards up to now have been lithographed, mostly anyway, from engravings and that kind of thing. It's not until around 1900 that you get the first cards that are made with halftones that are produced directly from photographs. So one of the companies that did that first in Canada was McCoy, which was out of the Maritimes. And this is actually a card from June of 1900. So very, very early for this type of card with a view on it that's done in halftone, which is like the little dots, the type of image. And that was done in June of, sorry, this card was postmarked in August 1900. The earliest known date for a card from this company is June of 1900. So it would be very unusual, almost unknown to find a card of this type from before 1900. So that's kind of the key date. And usually it's a few years later than that for the bulk of these types of cards in general, but there's some as early as this. Another example here from Montreal, 1901, another halftone of Place Vigier in Montreal. This is a card by Volman Brothers of Winnipeg. Being a Winnipegger, I collect these. There's only 4 of them. They're very, very scarce, but this card commemorates the departure of the troops at City Hall in Winnipeg to the Boer War, and has a picture of Harry Arnold, who was the leader of the Manitoba contingent that went to the Boer War. He was actually killed almost as soon as he got there by a sniper. But these cards were issued in late 1899, and they were printed in New York, actually, not locally. But again, very rare cards. I mean, there's just so few that I can almost show you all of them from this era just here. So another source of these really early cards is U.S. publishers. The Bowman one being from New York was an example, but these ones were made of Toronto. In the upper right, Arthur Strauss, a New York publisher, and the Detroit Photographic Company published the one at lower left, which is of Kingston. And so some of the American publishers, because the Americans were definitely ahead of us in getting these cards pumped out, published Canadian views as well. So you see those. The Detroit Photographic Company was an enormous publisher, published thousands and thousands of views across the US and many in Canada as well at that time. By 1903, you begin to get the real photo cards, which you may have some familiarity with. They're cards that were actual photographs developed onto a postcard back. So they became very popular uh, in 1905, 6 after that. But they go back as early as 1903 in Canada, and they were a product mainly of Kodak, uh, who had a product called Velox that allowed you to do this kind of printing of photographs. And that's one of their own cards advertising a demonstration of their product in 1902. The one at the left is a German example. Again, the Germans were way ahead of us in everything, and they had these photo cards as early as the mid 1890s. And you can find them. They don't think they're anything remarkable at all, so you can get them for almost nothing, even though something that old here would be cost you hundreds of dollars. But the Germans did do some, and that's an example there. In Canada, that's an example of the earliest you'd see a card like this, as far as I know. And that's the backs that look like that with that fancy old style printing saying private postcard. Those are the very earliest backs you see in Canada. That's Kodak Velox's first Canadian back, because the Canadian cards by the post office regulations had to be labeled private postcard, versus in the US they said private mailing card. So they had to make a special back for Canada that said private postcard, and that's it. That's the first one they made. You can see some of the other Canadian examples here. Another private postcard back, which is by far the most common early one, is at lower right, and lower left. Canadians often just use the American backs anyway, no matter what the post office said. So that's a Canadian private mailing card from 1904, which is very early. So any real photo card from 1903, certainly, or 1904 is a valuable, or maybe not valuable, but it's a rare thing, relatively speaking, to find photo cards from those years in Canada. You get the transition to the divided back in 1903-04. So it was actually allowed by order of the post office in December of 1903. The divided back allowed you to write a message on the back of the card, which hadn't previously been allowed. So that was a big step in the history of the postcard, because it allowed the front of the card to be occupied entirely by an image if they wanted. And then you got the divided back, of which a very early example is at the bottom right there. It allowed you to write your message on the back. So that was allowed in Canada as of the end of 1903. You very rarely see it, though they didn't take it up um, for a couple years. You were allowed to send, like, one of the reasons that it wasn't too popular was because the US didn't adopt it till 1907, almost 3 or 4 years later. So there was a lot of doubt about whether you could send the Canadian divided back cards to the US, which is where a lot of Canadian postcards were going. So that was why it wasn't too widely adopted in Canada right away. But that's an example of something that was sent successfully to the US with a divided back before divided backs were technically allowed in the US. You also had in 1906, basically up to 1913, the classic real photo postcard RPPC era, which is when the real photo cards got to be really high quality, such as this example from Winnipeg. It's a higher quality than the ones we were looking at before from 1903 or 4. They really mastered the art within a couple of years, and photographers were churning these out in enormous numbers. Of different varieties of cards, particularly in Western Canada. Same in the States. It tends to be a Western phenomenon. But there are tons from Toronto as well of real photo cards. It's another sort of classic example from Saskatchewan of a real photo scene. Small town, railway station, that kind of thing are very, very sought after. Very evocative cards, some of the very best images of that era of Canadian history. Following that, you get the white border era, which you hear about sometimes. So that's just basically what it says. It's not that exciting. It's just that the cards, which previously had images that covered the entire front of the card once they had the divided back. So they had the images as at upper right there, covering the entire front of the card. They reduced them slightly and put a white border, as in the lower image there, around them. And that became common in about 1915. And for about 15 years, the one at lower right is sort of the standard postcard in Canada or the United States with the white border around it. They did that supposedly because during the war years, ink was precious. And actually, I measured it once by putting that white border, it actually cuts down the surface area that you're covering with ink quite a lot. So that was, I guess, the impetus. And it also made it easier to cut because you had a bit more room for error when you were cutting the cards out of the sheets that they were printed on. Anyway, those are a couple of examples on a nautical theme. And some more white border examples. Again, they would just put like the captions of the cards in the white borders often. So typical examples from Valentine and Sons, important Canadian manufacturer. And then after that, we will have heard of the linen era. The linen card is usually attributed to Kurt Teich Company of Chicago. And they're the famous cards, particularly in the US, um, that had, as you see here, extremely bright, vivid colors on them. And they actually have a textured surface that's a little bit like cloth, which is why they're called linen cards. And it's supposedly because of that bumpy surface that the colors can be so rich, and also because of some advances in technology relating to ink. So from about 1930 up until the 50s, these cards were, kind of the dominant and prototypical card of the era. So they're very beautiful. There's some examples here of American linen cards. It shows some of just how creative and stunning the card designs were. Very much the sort of cards that everybody sent in the time of our parents or grandparents. So they're cards like that. They were also made in Canada, often by the Kurt Teich Company as well. So this is an example from Montreal, restaurant advertising. Somehow the ones we had aren't quite as bright, I think partly because we didn't have places like Florida where you had bright colors of things just in the environment, but they're still very interesting. This is an example for a company called Canadian Colonial Airways, again showing a aviation theme. That's a Kurt Teich card. There's a little code on it at the lower right that tells you that it was made in 1941, which makes sense. Toronto linen cards. That's a Valentine and Sons card at the left there, Humber Valley, and the one on the right is of the horse show at the X. So there's lots of cards like that of Canada too, which are quite collectible these days. Even though I said that the linen era started in 1930, it actually didn't. The type of card, the type of paper with the linen surface existed before that. And I even have a Canadian example from 1914. You can see the linen texture on the card there. The difference was uh, they didn't have the colors that Kurt Teich and similar companies used later, but it still is linen. It's exactly the same surface. So I don't know the story of that exactly, or who really invented it, but there are earlier examples. These ones go back to France in 1907. At the lower left there, I just put an enlargement so you can sort of see what the linen surface actually looks like. It looks actually like fabric. And again, they didn't use the bright yellows and oranges that Tyke used, but it does create still a kind of a unique color tone to it, even in these cards. So there you go with that. In Canada during the same period, um, we also had a characteristic type of card that was much more common here than the linens were, and that is these cards by the Photogelatin Engraving Company of Ottawa, which you might kind of call Canada's Kurt Teich, slightly less appealing, quite a bit less appealing maybe in terms of the view of how they look than the Teich cards, but these are the cards that everybody sent for decades in Canada. if you have old photo albums at home, if they have postcards, stuck in them, as often is the case, they'll be these ones. This is how Canadians saw their country for 20 or 30 years. So even if they're slightly homely, sometimes they're very significant and kind of endearing cards. And there's just a few of them there. They were printed through a process called collotype that gave sort of a washed out kind of look to a photograph, to a reproduction of a photograph like you see at the lower right there. And then they could also color them, which they did sometimes, as in the other two. So they have a very characteristic look to them, and they made these by the tens of thousands of different views over that period. Some of them are really quite nice or interesting, such as this one of the Hollinger mine up at Timmins, 1920s. Again, just the style of card and the style of photo reproduction kind of lends itself to that image. So there can be very interesting uh, Pico cards, as they're called, photogelatin engraving company. And there's some that are really kind of neat too, similar to the way the type cards are, the bright image of cars parked at the beach at Port Elgin, and a couple of other cards again where the variety of colors is taken advantage of. These are from the 40s. That's a very nice one of the train station at Grand Beach on Lake Winnipeg. Again, terrific card. So although they're not all really interesting views, some of them are worth seeking out, and they're nice to find. That's one of a sightseeing car in Quebec City, another Pico card. For 1934, you can tell it's 1934 because there's actually a movie poster on the wall there advertising a Lionel Barrymore movie that you can look up. Those are always nice to see in pictures because you can often date the photograph very accurately from that. So it's 1934. Almost every city had those types of touring cars, often, as in this case, running on the streetcar tracks. And you often see postcards of them. And then finally, just to wrap it up, the final type of postcard after the linen era and after those Pico cards began to run out of, or to fall out of fashion, are the chrome cards, or what we call the chrome cards, which is short for chromolithographic, which is a style of color photo reproduction that began in the 1930s and by the 1950s had begun to take over postcard production. They created postcards of the type that we would all remember from when we were young, that we used to buy, that look a lot like color photographs. Not quite as good maybe in some ways, but they're still very interesting. And they're, until recently, I think they were shunned by collectors as being just too recent, but now there's a bit more time has passed, and they're becoming pretty collectible now as well, especially nice ones. So that's one of Toronto, um, when it was just beginning to develop into the city we know today. And you can look at some of you can do close-ups on things, and you can see there that's City Hall, and then there's a big rectangle there, which is obviously the construction site for what's now the Sheraton Center Hotel. Kind of neat to look at postcards from all these eras and see all the different things that were going on at the time of the card. So that would be in the late 60s, I guess, or in the 60s. As you can see, some of the chromes are really, really nice cards, really interesting. You've got the motel cards at the top. Some of them are very artistic, like the one for the Casablanca Hotel that's at the right there. Then really great street scenes. That's Owlett Avenue in Windsor, looking down towards the buildings of Detroit on the other side, and RCMP boat in the Sioux Locks. Right. So there's all kinds of things from the 50s and 60s that are now becoming sort of ancient history and becoming much more collectible than they were 10 or 20 years ago. And there's a few more cards. The card of the Edmund Fitzgerald at the top right was, I think, hurriedly reissued with a bit of an overprint after they realized that they had a pretty saleable card when it sank. And then cards of other places around the world, often really beautiful. And so that's the end of the presentation. And I just wanted to say just a word from our sponsor that Toronto Postcard Club, we would hope you all, if you're interested, consider joining. We publish a magazine every 3 times a year, which is pretty interesting. And even if you don't join, you're more than welcome to attend our annual sale, which is in February this year at the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center.